and do is mostly, maybe address the high points of aircraft purchase. Also make this relevant from the perspective of the audience. I understand we are addressing the students and also trying to ignite the interest of aviation law in students. And therefore, why aircraft purchase is an important topic. Why should aviation law be of interest to students particularly? As India, maybe we can go to the next slide, Namita. So we will touch upon a few topics. Of course, I will give you an industry overview. And Namita will then maybe introduce the session, providing a snapshot of the aircraft purchase, and we'll of course quickly go through the formal, steps of aircraft purchase, where you will understand the importance of airplane configuration. What is the build process like? Because as you know, an aircraft and a ship both take more than a year to build. And there are more than 1 million parts that come together to make an aircraft. It's one of the most sophisticated machinery that is available and has been flying for the last now so many years. And then we will see what is the delivery process like, what goes into a delivery process. Towards the end, we will save the legalese for the end, where we will go through the purchase documentation and give you certain high points, at least, from a legal perspective that are important and of course, very, very material when we do any aircraft purchase transaction. So next slide, Namita. So from an industry overview, just to tell you, India is the third largest aviation market in the world today. We are the third largest also aircraft purchasing market, only behind United States and China. And if we read our economic survey, which is published annually, any one of law students as well as lawyers who want to practice corporate and commercial law should read the economic survey, because it sets out what the India and the Indian government are doing in the coming years. And the economic survey speaks about a price parity between railways and airlines. And what is expected already, for example, if you were to purchase an executive class ticket in a Shatabdi train from Delhi to Amritsar, the price is about 1,800 rupees, sorry. And if you were to buy a lowest fare between Delhi and Amritsar, it's about 2,200 rupees. So what is expected in the coming couple of years? Of course, COVID was a big dampener. But what is expected is in the next or next to next year, there will be a price parity between the two media of travel. And what will happen is we will see at least one person from every family moving on from railways to air as a medium of transport. Now that will result in a 6 times growth in the Indian market for passenger traffic, as well as create a huge opportunity for aviation and aviation lawyers in the country. Presently, next slide, Namita. Presently, for example, the nearest comparison of population is China. India has only 700 aircraft, or 700 thereabouts. We are at 622 today. China at the same point of time has 6,100 aircraft. So you can imagine the volume gap that we have and the opportunity that us lawyers have to play in this sector. Also, you will see that the demand of passengers in India is far lower. And this is what we are talking about, 6 times growth in the coming next 15 to 16 years. And therefore, what we expect is a huge order book of aircraft. India already, as I told you, has a potential aircraft growth of more than 6,000 aircraft in the coming years. And coupled with that, what we see is that, the next 20 years also sees a great focus on technology. Already industry experts speak that the last 20 years, if you were to take 2000 to 2050 as 50 years of change, the period between 2000 to 2020 has been the slowest pace of change that we are going to see from 2000 to 2050. So what we are going to see in the coming 30 years is a great focus on technology, on fuel efficiency. Namita will talk about the new types of aircraft and how they are more fuel efficient. And obviously that brings along with it cost efficiency. By 2040, we also expect that the latest generation would constitute a majority of the fleet. And therefore, our Prime Minister has already committed that by 2050, India will be carbon neutral. So therefore, a younger fleet will be more efficient and more cost effective. Next slide, Namita. Over to you. Yeah.
Thanks, Anand. That was very helpful. Thanks, Kashish, and all the panelists who spoke earlier. So on this, like Anand has given an introduction that where is the industry going. So like we discussed that the Indian aviation industry is obviously going to see a lot of growth. So now to tie into that growth, there has to be, we are talking about aircrafts in this session. So there has to be enough aircraft within the country with all the airlines to meet the requirement. That is the obvious next step. So which is why we are talking about what is a fleet size. Now, why? So the fleet size has to increase in the country so that we have enough and more assets to cater to the increasing demand. Now, how does one manage the fleet size? Because suddenly demand is raising. We are all talking about it. We won't have aircraft sitting here within that time. So the planning starts with all the aviation players right now, whether they are the manufacturers who will get the demand and start manufacturing. But there are two things to that. One is obviously what is the industry demand, like Anand mentioned. The other one is an operational demand. Here is where we are talking about there are different shapes and sizes and prices of the aircraft. So you have to plan according to your operation of that particular airline. Then there's fuel efficiency. Now, why is fuel efficiency important? This is a factor. I mean, it's a aviation fun fact. I don't know how many, non-aviation lawyers or people just on that front. Is because, for example, whenever a airline starts their first flight, they take into consideration the duration. So what would be the fuel efficiency? And the fuel efficiency is also dependent on aircraft to aircraft, further on including things like where do you park your cargo, for example, whether on the belly of the, towards the belly or up. So therefore, there's a lot of variable which needs to be considered while one plans the fleet, which is of course tying up to the demand. Gauri, next slide, please. Thank you. So now how does, we already touched upon on why do we need to, plan our fleet so that it's cost efficient and demand. And now what are the factors do we consider when we do the fleet planning? So of course, the first one is the cost of the aircraft and type cost, because with every upgrade, there is a price implication. Ultimately the financing, which Richard spoke about, is the key of how the business functions. Then what are the maintenance intervals of these aircraft, and how will the pilots and the flight attendants be able to operate? For example, here I would just stop here and example, if we look at the Boeing Max, which got grounded. So what was the issue there? The issue was of software. While it's disputed all over, but it was also on how the pilots are operating and all the software. The whole dispute was how that was being done. So therefore, when new assets are being ordered, in factors including this, whether your human resource, which is your pilot and your flight attendants, how can they operate it, or how efficient it is. Then what if a new aircraft is not proven and there is much data on maintenance? For example, this is where Max would also come in, that it was operated, but the operation wasn't used. So therefore, which aircraft are you inducting into your fleet is very important. Whether it's a used aircraft, new aircraft, those are also consideration. And of course, then there are the usual, parameters of how are the passenger experiences relate to, and how does the aircraft type vary and fit into the airline network. Because, for example, here a point is that some airlines, when they start with a narrow body aircraft. Now, whether those narrow bodied aircraft are good for, say, a small duration. Now, this airline starts flying long duration. So that aircraft might not be suitable to fly that duration. So therefore you need to, whether you have a mixed fleet or you have one type of fleet, depends on a way, a lot of factors which we just talked about. Gauri, next.
Thanks.
Over
Thanks.
to you, Anand.
Thank you. So also there are several types of aircraft which are presently, available for purchase. Of course, we have seen recently military aircraft, the deal that we did with France, Concords, which are now, rare, commuter lines, regional short haul, feeder line aircraft, narrow body and wide body. Wide body is what we normally see as the A380s, etc. And of course, passenger aircrafts and jets and jumbo jets. So the complexities of a purchase transaction may differ on the basis of the nature of an aircraft. Such as, let us say Dreamliner was introduced by Boeing and Air India became the first customer. But what we saw with Dreamliner was that, there was a faulty door issue. And of course, a lot of media and inquiries were made into how the government acquired Dreamliners, etc. So I think all of these issues are dependent on the type of aircraft that is purchased. And as Namita was saying, the issues around new aircraft and old aircraft are always complex, and they are subject to, several moving pieces that are to be considered at the time of an aircraft purchase.
Anand, I have a short point to add on that one. So just as a trivia of the sector, like Anand mentioned, that of the Dreamliner, here also like Concorde, which were very, interestingly, they used to, they were supposed to reduce the journey from New York to, Tokyo for 6 hours, I think. But the implication of these kind of, now again, the fleet management, we can bring in here also. For example, there's a company called Boom, because Concords were removed because of the price implication, the ozone layer implication, and also the fuel implication. So however, with the whole travel and COVID coming into play, there is a company called Boom who is coming out and has tied up with the United Airlines of the US. Again, they're assuring Concorde level of speed. Of course, price would be an implication. However, before implementing that, now we are all talking about sustainability and environment and so on and so forth. So again, we are yet to test on how Boom, will it see the same fate as a Concorde, or how will the fleet, will there also be a viable option of travel considering the price implication and the environment is something that, like just to add on to what Anand mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah. Right. And the players in the Indian aviation sector are, of course, the manufacturers, the operators, and the end-use consumers. Manufacturers, as you know, are Bombardier, Airbus, and Boeing. Boeing is a US company, Airbus is French, and Bombardier is Canadian. In India, we, of course, have a lot of airlines presently who are called operators, and they operate under an aircraft operating license, which I think Mr. Sharma covered yesterday. And these are Indigo, Air India, SpiceJet, Vistara, Akasa, Go Air, and of course, end-use consumers are consumers like us. Next slide. Gauri, thank you. Right. So, Namita, do you want to take this slide?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now we, to start on the manufacturing, or rather the building. So what we were talking until now is that how is the demand moving? Are we ready? What do we need? And of course, the point is on aircraft, so that we need more assets to cater to the demand. Now, coming on the topic in itself, that why is the building bit so critical? So here is, if you look at, we began this session by saying that the asset here is a multi-million-dollar asset. It involves an OEM, it involves various parts, and it involves suppliers. So it's a multi-jurisdictional point, and also a lot of components are involved. If you look at the slide here, why the reason we have put it here is, all of this will be talking subsequently, but if you see, the first picture is of an airframe. so a airframe is the main frame which is manufactured by, say, a Boeing or an Airbus. Suppose that there'll be wings, there's something called a buyer furnished equipment. Those are at the option of the buyer. For example, what seats do you want to use, because the weight of the seats also have an implication on the efficiency of the flight. Then of course, then there's a whole assembly process. So what we are trying to say is there's an airframe, there are parts which come, then the assembly happens, and this process is where the contracts and the commercials come into the place. So this is where we will be tying in with all the concepts subsequently. Gauri, if you can change that. Yeah. So now we spoke about all the parts, how tedious it is. Now on the, I also mentioned that this is a cross jurisdictional process. So what we are trying to explain in this slide is, if you look, this is a Boeing example for now, we are taking that. So the first picture that you see is how Boeing manufactures. So Boeing's main delivery and assembly facility is at Seattle, Renton. However, because the parts are so big, they say, for example, the frame comes from Utah. They come, and we, in fact, Anand and I had the good fortune of visiting that facility thanks to our, client. But for example, from Utah, it was explained to us by the Boeing facility people that the airframe, which is a green color, frame, it comes on a train, and the frame is parked for a bit. Then there's an assembly line where the frame will be put in, and then all the parts start coming onto the frame. So that's how your aircraft manufacturing happens. Now, the complicated bit here, what I just spoke about in the previous slide, is it is not just Boeing products which are getting, or rather OEM, a manufacturer's product which is getting fit in. There are suppliers, the customer will choose some, there will be some designated suppliers. So there are a lot of people who come, and the assembly happens at Renton, Seattle. Now, once the aircraft is there, there are various processes which we will talk subsequently. Then, like Richard mentioned, then we travel to the lessor jurisdiction, and from there, the aircraft comes to India. Now, the point is, obviously, I'm sure we spoke about in the previous session on how the ownership is different. Aircrafts are bought on a leasing basis as an operator. So this is a picture of a typical operating lease that we are talking about, how the aircraft flies through. So now, how is this relevant to the current topic, is because all of the contracts perspective, the legal considerations that happen vis-a-vis the OEM, whether it's Boeing or Airbus, will happen at the first picture level. That is where it's important. Second, when we reach the Ireland map, that is where the leasing will happen. And India, of course, the customer is sitting here. So every contract has an implication from India. So this is the overview of the why are these contracts as complicated as they are. Gauri, if we can move to the next slide. Sure. So now the next part is on build to purchase. This is how the process overall looks like. So of course, like when we buy any asset, there are the good news or bad news in this sector is that there are only three, or rather say two main OEMs here, whether it's Boeing or Airbus. So you obviously discuss with them. There's a price implication. What kind of flight do you want to use? So everything adds up to these discussions. And that's when the next step is, that's how when you choose the OEM. Once you have chosen the OEM, and how you will also choose the OEM comes to the second point, which is your aircraft configuration. Now, even when we buy a speaker or even a car, we look at the specs. So this is where the specs come in, which is the configuration of the aircraft. And this ties into everything that we talked about. Whether the avionics configuration, software configuration, what your aircraft finally is capable of doing is where is the configuration that is being offered by the relevant OEM, and what do you choose from those configurations. Now, once you have chosen those configuration, then comes your implementation, which is the aircraft build process. So once it is implemented is once it's assembled, and then the delivery process happens. Now, the fifth box that you see here is on the documentation and warranties, because like we already spoke about the interface of various stakeholders here, the documentation becomes very relevant from the OEM's perspective and from the buyer's perspective, because what are my obligation? The OEM will say that I'm giving you this is my product. that you are getting from another supplier, so that is there. So this whole process is what the topic is today, that how is this addressed and what are the key points vis-a-vis the documentation. Gauri, next slide, please. Now, as a carry forward of the previous slide, this slide talks about how, what is the back-end activities and how does this tie up to the broader life cycle that we talked about in the previous slide. First is sales and marketing. Now, this is where the customer will go and meet the sales guys of the OEM. They at this stage, and then comes the engineering and manufacturing once you're okay with all of that, and then the post-delivery. Now, between each of these steps, like I said, sales and marketing happens between the customer and the OEM. At this stage, the proposal is accepted. The definitive agreements are negotiated, the purchase contracts. The configuration, like I said, is zeroed in. The suppliers are selected, and also what are the certificate. Now, this asset needs certificate to whether fly or, to fly out of, say, America and to even fly in India. So there are various roadmaps for what certification are we going for, and whether, and it's a negotiated term. So whether is, say, for example, if Boeing or say Airbus is making their an aircraft that any airline in India is buying, they will give you their YASA certification. Now it's a negotiation tactic, whether you can convince them and show them value that, look, without an DGCA, which is my Indian regulator, without that certification, it's pointless for me to get the aircraft from France to India. So now that is where the negotiation part comes in also. There are various market precedents on that. It's no standard rule on this one. Yeah. Then comes your engineering and, sorry.
A good example, for example, is that India and the United States are the only two countries that have satellite navigation as an important element of civil aviation. So while, let us say if you are flying in a CIS country or, even a United Kingdom or Africa or, any other place, satellite navigation is optional. So, so in that sense, India and the regulators' requirement is very, very important. Go ahead now. Yeah, Namita.
Thanks. Thank you, Anand. So in the next point, which is engineering and manufacturing. So once you have agreed on all of that, now comes your implementation, what we already talked about, the technical coordination meetings, because like I said here, all the galleys, all of the labs that we see on an aircraft, everything is selected and your technical teams coordinate. These is entirely an engineering process. Then your final foreign certification plan happens. This is when what Anand just said will finally be agreed at this stage. Then your rollout and your delivery. Now, what do we mean by rollout and what do we mean by delivery? Now, rollout is when, because, Anand can correct me if I'm wrong, but what we saw at the Boeing facility was that you enter and there's a line where the frame goes and one step at each part gets, keeps getting added. So at the end, the aircraft is rolled out. Now, once it is rolled out, is it ready for delivery? No, because, it could be, but there are processes within the documentation to fulfill. The customer, the OEM will inspect it itself. They will have some ground tests, which we will talk about. Then the customer will inspect it itself. And if all is kosher, that's when the delivery happens. And delivery has a lot of processes, which we will also talk about. And finally, of course, the post-delivery support that happens, whether it's a credit worthiness certificate and all of that. So that is how we are on this stage. Go next. Yeah. So the next part is on aircraft configuration. So here we will talk in detail as how the configuration cycle happens. It is more or less on what we spoke earlier. So I'll quickly brush through those. The first one is obviously the proposal acceptance. So when I speak about the proposal acceptance, key point here, the proposal is like, to put in very simple terms, the proposal is like a term sheet, and the definitive agreement comes in when you finally have visibility on what your commercials and how are you agreeing, and who are your lessors, you're factoring in everything. So that's how both the steps are put. But proposal is not a mandatory thing, because in a recent deal, we did not sign a proposal, whereas in other deals you do. That's like a term, binding, non-binding, however. But between these two stages, the important points on the config discussions happen. The customer, they can tell you that these are the configurations we provide. You do have the flexibility depending on your commercials, that they will just say, oh, you want this configuration, give it to us, we'll give it to you for extra money. But point is, whether you want to go for those commercials is where the commercial angle of the deals also come in. Fact to be noted here is the asset in this kind of a transaction is so huge that it is not just a law, a unified law that is governing this contract, but it is also the way these deals are structured. As in, what are the typical configurations provided? If there's an extra configuration, how much amount is given? So there's flexibility, commercial flexibility to the parties also. Then we come on implementation. Of course, here is what we spoke about, that the configs get implemented, assembled, then rollout and delivery, final test and flight test is where it happens. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now, as you know, what we have established so far vis-a-vis the aircraft is that configs, your specs specify what your aircraft cannot do and what aircraft is it. Now, once you have zeroed in on a config, do you even have the flexibility to change? Answer to that is yes, because ultimately the end user decide what he wants and what he doesn't. But there's a method to how this is done. Is if you want to do it between the initial and the final configuration, you can obviously, you have record option. There's a mechanism on what you will agree with your OEM. Once you have signed the document, now at the implementation, if you want to change the configuration, now that process is, there are two ways of doing it. Either you agreed upfront in your contract, or what we recently heard with an OEM is that they say that we discuss and finalize these things, and that's how it's an evolving process. So there's either you can document it, or it could be a commercial discussion. That's there. Now, after that, once post delivery happens, now if you want to change them, then even for that point, there is a specific provision in your contract, which is called a retrofit provision, which comes in a maintenance contract, etc. How you can upgrade or change a few points of your few configs of your aircraft. So as you see, the point that we are trying to make here is, taking from the last point, is that these contracts do have commercial flexibility, and the logic is simple, because the airline is using it. So it is the airline who can decide what they want, but it also depends whether your manufacturer can offer it to you. They will always offer everything for extra money, but then again, we have to meet at the middle ground and see how these aircrafts meet our requirement. And for that, we have the configuration changes, which we just spoke about. Next slide, please. Yeah. So now this is the stage one, as we call it. Now we will be talking about how the aircraft configuration happens. Now, while we have touched this upon, an aircraft comprises either of an OEM product or supplier product. Now, the distinction here is, from a legal perspective, it is important, because who is standing behind these products? Whether it is the OEM warranty, for the legal concept here that is relevant is, who's warranting these products? Say, for example, if you're buying from Boeing, is Boeing warranting everything just because they're assembling it? So all of that aspects we'll be dealing with when we talk about the documentation. But for now, the distinction which we have to remember throughout this discussion is that one is the Boeing product, which they manufacture according to their standard, which is the OEM product, could be an Airbus product, whatever. Then there are the supplier products, because these are where it is the supplier, the customer coming in front. They have the, the flexibility to choose who are the supplier, what kind of seats they want. So for all of that is a separate bucket. So these buckets are important, because this is where our legal obligation of the OEM comes in, and our rights on who is standing behind the quality assurance of my products comes in here. So yeah, so once you have, like we said, that once you have decided on your configuration, then comes your build process. So we will be now giving a snapshot on how the building happens. So simply to start with, and what does an OEM do? It assembles, it manufactures. If it is an OEM product, it will manufacture. If it is ultimately at the assembly line, they will assemble all of it and give you the aircraft. So here, if you look at the first bit on manufacturer, we have made that distinction. But this, what happens after that is they give you the customer quality support, which is sales. They have multiple teams: their sales team, their warranty team, their customer engineering team. Because these are not layman things. There are manuals after manuals which you will have to read, and how they assemble all of this. So these are the specifics that they keep in mind, because they will have a spec, and their engineers will keep ticking it, and that's how the assembly also happens. Then comes the customer review process also. Now that the customer has the right to inspect, the customer representative can be at the OEM facility. It all depends whether you have what kind of whether you want to do it over the phone, or whether you want your people to visit there once or stay there for 6 months. We have seen precedents for both. Then here comes a customer review location. So where do you, depending on where it is being manufactured. For example, in Boeing, what happens is there is an assembly for your commercial aircraft at Renton, Seattle. But then there is Everett facility, which is the biggest aircraft manufacturing and assembly facility, where there are those other kind of aircrafts. And if it is a defense aircraft, where is it coming from? So these are the different locations which you have to agree upfront, because these are and it's not as simple as buying even something as big as a house, because here your parts are something that you will have to live with. And one, I would quote Anand here on our negotiation, is that he said that the OEM and the airline are, one is as good or as bad as the OEM is. So therefore, your products, wherever they are, you have to, this is where your their bill process comes in, what quality assurances they are using, what location they are giving. Everything has a cost implication. Therefore, all of these concepts are pegged to the the documentation, and that's where the customer has to clearly evaluate what is it that he's looking for, how much money is going in them, what is the ultimate implication on the pricing, so on, and also the delivery schedule. Yes, the bill process is very important, because this will determine, like we said in the beginning, an airline takes approximately 12 months to be manufactured. So therefore, with that, the everything that you are doing, your inspection, your pricing, everything ties up to the delivery schedule ultimately. If you could please move on.
Also, just one more point. When we order a fleet, let us say we order 10 aircraft. 10 aircraft would be delivered over a duration of time. Sometimes, because the manufacturer only has this much capacity. So let us say Boeing could manufacture 500 aircraft in a year for the whole world, and of one type, let us say. So those also have to be, there are slots which are there, which have to be purchased. And therefore, the delivery schedule is something that Namita, of course, spoke about. So when you acquire a fleet, it's not as if you buy 10 aircraft and you'll get all the 10 on the same day or within a month of each other. You could have them, spread over a period of 3 to 7 years as well. Go ahead, Namita.
Right. Just a small point, Anand will add. One of the anecdotes from our meetings with Boeing is that they said, for example, we told them that what if, because of how it happens is in the assembly line, assuming Vistara buys from Boeing and assuming Akasa is buying from Boeing, Vistara aircraft could be before Akasa. And if there's a delay in Vistara aircraft, there could also be a subsequent delay in Akasa aircraft, because they're all on the same assembly line. So what they were trying to say is that it is not practically possible to lift one aircraft, say the Vistara aircraft, and put Akasa in front, or do the reverse. So this delivery schedule, that's why it is tied up to the documentation so tightly, because when do you start your operation is also contingent on how their assembly line is going, which is Anand was just mentioning.
Yeah. And so there are early warning systems that are put into the contract, that if there are any delays, then both parties have to be notified. The schedules are moving. So it's a very, very, if I may say, bilateral process, and not a unilateral process with the original equipment manufacturer or the OEM, in this case being Boeing, or in case not Boeing, Airbus. So.
Yeah. Sure. So the next point and the third stage is the delivery process. So here is where everything will come and tie in on what we were talking about. So now let's look at it that the rollout has happened. Everything has been okay, and your aircraft is out of the assembly line and is ready. Now, like we mentioned earlier, it could or couldn't or may not be worthy of delivery, or rather to your specs. So what happens first is there's a pre-flight testing, which is done. So yeah, sorry, before I start, this delivery process has obligations of the OEM, could be Airbus or Boeing, and of the customer, because first they will do their test, then they'll give it to you, then you will come and do your test. Now, if you find any defect there, now that defect correction is the mechanism that you will finally agree in your documentation. So that's how everything ties up, commercial aspect with the legal aspect. So first, the pre-flight, and the pre-flight is the first ground functioning test flight, which is done by the manufacturer. Here they would test, for example, from all the, say, they don't test avionics engine, which is done at the production flight, but here they test your regular stuff like braking, your landing gears, etc. And how they are, they're taxing in their facility itself, because they have those test grounds. Now come your production flight. These are the other functional tests. Here comes how much fuel efficiency is the fuel efficiency is the aircraft doing, how much load are they taking, so on and so forth. How are your softwares functioning, because their softwares are very important part of your how your aircraft operates. So these are the 2 points where it is done. Now, once any OEM does these 2 sets, then the customer introduction meeting happen and the customer walk happens here. Now, these are obviously, so what happens is that the engineering teams of both the parties, they meet, they open the specs that they agreed, they will walk around. First, they will walk around the aircraft and see the interiors and exteriors. If all the physical points are okay vis-a-vis the specs, then also comes your software, etc. So in legal terms, for us as lawyers, what is important is that say if we are representing an airline, your airline is getting the opportunity to go and inspect the product before it is being delivered. So this, if you tie in with the contract law, comes your concept of buyer beware. You may know that something is wrong, or rather you got the opportunity to figure out whether something was wrong or not. Now, whether that dilutes your liability, or rather your ability to ask for a claim later, is something that I think, Anand, you wanted to quote an example here.
Yeah, so I think one example that we have seen, of course, was in the case of a Romanian airline taking an aircraft on lease, where what had happened was that the customer did inspect the aircraft, and after the aircraft was inspected, it was taken on lease and it was flown. But then, the hull had problems, the main airframe, with the paint. And as a result of the paint coming off, the aircraft was obviously, it had a crack underneath the paint, and that could not be seen by the plain eye. The court went on to hold that, that it cannot be said that this was the customer's fault, and also brought in the concept of the intended purpose, that, who had the expertise of producing the aircraft, whereas, the operator or the airline had the ability to only operate it, and they were not supposed to be, so there are, of course, case law on both sides. This is a very, very sensitive topic when it comes to a customer walk. We have had airlines such as, Indigo, which says that it doesn't want to do the customer walk, and asks for delivery of the aircraft in India straight away, and asks, the seller or the OEM to include that price as a service addition in their price. Whereas there are, of course, other customers such as SpiceJet, which does do an inspection at the Boeing facility and get satisfied about the quality of the asset. So I think both those examples are there. And there are, of course, risks on both the sides associated with it, as well as costs. Gauri, maybe you can move to the next slide. Thank you.
Anand, would you like me to take this up?
Yeah, please do. No.
And I have got a reminder, and I know, Kashif, that we are running short of time. I'll try as quickly as possible. So here, what we have said so far is tying up here, that the customer demonstration flight happens. It's not just they go and walk, now that pilot could be either mine, that is the customers, or the OEMs, depending on your cost thing, whether you are willing to get your pilot to fly from here to Seattle to test it, or you trust Boeing's pilot, that's up to you. So here, a pilot that you've agreed on will fly your aircraft and see if all the specs are okay, if landing, taking off is fine. Then your document review happens, because here, before the delivery process starts, you agree on an agenda. There are 120 things to be ticked off, because there's also an assignment to the lessor which will happen. You will have to sign off on the spec, because once you sign that this asset is as per my specs, that's when your, the buyer beware is done. So that is how, sorry, Anand, you were saying something.
I was just saying, like, to give you a sense of how many documents are involved, it's about 3 feet of paper per aircraft. So
apparently it has been digitized now, because they did so the fun fact here for everybody is, during the COVID, apparently one of the airline manufacturers got their aircraft done on time. They did a Zoom delivery. I think that was told to us. So that was the delivery can happen anyhow now, apparently. So then the certificate process is super important, because without your certification, the flying out of that jurisdiction and coming to your jurisdiction is obviously an issue. Then there's delivery and customer flyaway, where transfer of ownership happens. And then, of course, here there are 2-3 important, like what I'm trying to achieve here is that things as simple as that, when your aircraft flies from Seattle to Ireland, assuming, so who fills in how much fuel on that, and how many refueling will happen, how many pilots will be there, whose pilot are there, those are also processes which are discussed and documented. Coming back and reiterating the same point, that these contracts are legal and commercial. It's up to, it's the relationship between the airline and the OEM that works. Gauri, next slide, please.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So
on purchase documentation, there are 3 parts to the agreement. There is, of course, the general terms agreement, which is the standard motherhood, document that goes with all purchases on that type of aircraft. So let us say, we are talking of the latest Boeing Maxes. So there is a GTA that goes with it, a general terms agreement. Along with that is a purchase agreement, which is specific to every purchaser or acquirer of aircraft, as well as there are letter agreements which provide for special let us say credits which are given for purchase price adjustment. Credits could be in the form of spare parts, so they give you spare part support. So the price is therefore reduced by spare part support, or they give you marketing support, or they give you training support, or they give you training support in the sense of, let us say, pilots. So of course, one aspect which we haven't discussed at length is the availability of pilot and crew. And there, of course, pilots have to be certified to fly these aircraft. And therefore, simulators is an important piece of aircraft fleet acquisition, as well as crew training is. And then, of course, there is the induction cost, because every time you induct a new type of aircraft or an existing type, or you mix your fleet, there is an induction cost. So the letter agreements cater to all of those exceptions. There is also the maintenance and repair contracts, which are with the MRO, as well as the product support assurance document, which is about the Boeing, or let us say the OEM products which they provide, not the buyer furnished equipment, but the Boeing products themselves. And that document addresses what happens if those parts of an aircraft go bad. And so for today's discussion, since we are only touching upon the high points of a purchase transaction, we will be talking of warranties a little bit, delays, delivery schedule, payment schedule, which we have touched upon. Delivery schedule, which we discussed, could be moving or delayed. Payment schedule that goes with an aircraft. Price escalation mechanism, which is normally tied into a certain number that is agreed because the aircraft is produced over and delivered over a period of time. So obviously, nobody wants to absorb the risk of labor and metal. Uh, Maintenance and repair, and of course, governing law, which Richard also mentioned, is normally US law, but I think we'll touch upon those points. Namita, over to you.
Sure. Yeah. So now the next.
I think, shall we ask Kashish, how much time do we have, Kashish? It's 6 o'clock already.
I think another 7 minutes up, because
okay, so maybe we will cover the text, or at least the points that we want to cover, and then maybe we can respond to the questions by email. Is that fair?
Right, sir. Absolutely. We can do that.
Because I think Priya must be waiting.
Yes, she's already on board. She's waiting in the.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
Apologies, Priya. We'll wind up quickly. So the next one is on warranties. So we've already spoke about that. Warranties, basically who's standing by who do you have a recourse for? So every OEM has their own process of warranty claim, whether they can dispute, how does it change your contract. So short point, like we discussed, your OEM products are signed up, warranted by, has a warranty from the OEM, which is typically 4 to 5 years and depends on a negotiated deal. And rest of the products that you see, BFE supplier products and supply furnished products, are all direct warranty from the specific supplier. So your OEM is not standing behind them, although they might be assembling them or might be even getting them from their known suppliers. That's just the way the practice happens. Next slide, please. So this point is very important. This will tie up to your delivery schedule. So this is where so all of us know, at least in contract law, there's a concept of force majeure. So how that force majeure translates into an aviation contract is through the definition, through the concept of excusable delay. This is where an OEM gets the benefit. The first point here to be understood is that this concept of an excusable delay is not a reciprocal concept that will apply to even the airline if they cannot pay the money. No, it will only apply to the OEM if they are not able to, deliver to you on time. If certain pre-agreed events have happened, these are very standard, your typical force majeure events. Now, what are the implications of that? Now, typically how it is done is, if say an excusable delay happens between 6 months from the day you start manufacturing to till 6 months, then there will be a specific kind of point. They would say that you might have the right. Obviously nobody will terminate the contract, because you cannot terminate with one OEM and go to France and choose another. So you would have an arrangement of what is the reasonable recourse and in how much time they can give you. Now, if they shoot up and they delay beyond 12 months, now that is something everybody will look through. How is it even, impacting my entire delivery process? So you can have recourses basis commercial negotiations here. Apart from this, any other delay, there's no typical implications of any other delay that they have given here. And now moving on to the other concepts. Anand, would you like to discuss the governing law?
So I think governing law is again typically New York for state of Washington for Boeing. Because obviously they are comfortable in their home jurisdiction, and in maintenance and repair you can either do MRO contracts for the fleet maintenance. There are of course checks that happen. C checks is where there is of course a bigger maintenance, but A and B checks also happen. These are more finer points of aircraft maintenance and keeping it airworthy. There are also tax issues around this, especially with spare part management, as well as creation of a maintenance reserve, which is under a lease agreement. And I'm sure Richard would have dwelled upon it. As well as, there are, of course, the delivery schedule issues, which of course, we have already told you about. So I think we'll